Admiral Marcus Steel's coffee mug froze halfway to his lips as his eyes locked onto the small golden trident gleaming on the wrist of the woman being dragged past his office window. In 30 years of naval service, he'd seen thousands of personnel come and go, but that insignia worn by fewer than 2,500 people in the entire world made his blood run cold. The woman they were treating like a common trespasser was a Navy SEAL. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 hours earlier, the morning fog still clung to the waters of San Diego Bay like a shroud, muffling the sounds of the bustling Naval Base San Diego. The massive installation stretched across the waterfront, its gray warships and towering cranes creating a fortress of American naval power. Security was always tight, but today felt different. The base was hosting a high-profile ceremony honoring fallen Navy SEALs, and tensions were running high. Petty Officer 3rd Class Hannah Boyd had been manning the main gate since in 600 hours, her crisp uniform already wilting in the California heat. At 23, she was eager to prove herself, perhaps too eager. When she spotted the woman approaching the gate on foot, carrying a small military-style backpack, every instinct screamed potential threat. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s, average height with shoulder-length auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore faded jeans, scuffed hiking boots, and a plain gray t-shirt that had seen better days. Her face was unremarkable, the kind of person you might pass in a grocery store without a second glance. But there was something in the way she moved, a controlled precision that Boyd couldn't quite place. "Ma'am, this is a restricted military installation," Boyd called out, her hand instinctively moving to her sidearm. "Do you have authorization to be here?" The woman, who would later be identified as Isabella "Izzy" Reeves, stopped about 10 feet from the gate, her hands visible and relaxed at her sides. "I'm here for the memorial ceremony," she said quietly, her voice carrying a slight rasp that spoke of years of hard living. "For the fallen SEALs," Boyd's eyes narrowed. The ceremony was invitation only, restricted to active military personnel and families of the deceased. This woman clearly wasn't military, her posture was too relaxed, her appearance too civilian. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification in your invitation." Izzy reached slowly into her back pocket, producing a worn leather wallet. She handed over a California driver's license that identified her as Isabella M. Reeves, age 34, with an address in the mountains outside San Diego. No military ID, no invitation, nothing that would grant her access to one of the most secure naval installations in the country. "Ma'am, you're not on the authorized list," Boyd said, her voice taking on the authority she'd been trained to project. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately." "I understand," Izzy replied, her dark eyes never leaving Boyd's face. "But I need to be there for Logan." The name meant nothing to Boyd, but the way Izzy said it, with a mixture of pain and determination, made the young petty officer pause. Still, orders were orders. "Ma'am, I don't care who Logan is. Without proper authorization, you cannot enter this base. Please step back from the gate." That's when Senior Chief Petty Officer Vincent Cruz arrived, drawn by the commotion. At 45, Cruz was a career Navy man with 27 years of service under his belt. He'd seen every type of person try to gain unauthorized access to the base: protesters, journalists, mentally unstable individuals, and genuine security threats. This woman, however, didn't fit any of his usual categories. "What's the situation, Boyd?" Cruz asked, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades of commanding sailors. "Unauthorized civilian attempting to gain access to the memorial ceremony." "Senior Chief," Boyd replied crisply. "No military ID, no invitation. Claims she's here for someone named Logan." Cruz studied Izzy with the practiced eye of a security professional. She didn't look like a threat, but appearances could be deceiving. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to explain your business here. How do you know about the memorial ceremony?" Izzy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Logan Martinez was my teammate. He died in Syria 18 months ago. I should be on your list." The name Logan Martinez did ring a bell for Cruz. He'd heard it mentioned in connection with classified operations, but this woman was clearly a civilian. "Ma'am, if you were military, you'd have identification to prove it. Navy SEALs don't just disappear from our records." "Some of us do," Izzy said quietly. The cryptic response only raised more red flags for Cruz. He dealt with too many people claiming false military service, stolen valor cases that made his blood boil. This woman, with her civilian clothes and lack of credentials, was setting off every alarm bell in his head. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to submit to a security screening," Cruz announced, motioning for additional personnel. "Boyd, call Commander Wright. Tell her we have a potential stolen valor situation at the main gate." Within minutes, the situation escalated. Commander Jessica Wright arrived with a full security detail, her crisp uniform and no-nonsense demeanor, making it clear she wasn't in the mood for games. At 38, Wright had built her career on maintaining absolute security protocols, and she wasn't about to let some civilian with delusions of military service compromise her base. "What exactly are you claiming, Ms. Reeves?" Wright demanded, reading from the driver's license. "Are you saying you're a Navy SEAL?" Izzy's silence stretched for long seconds. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was." The response drew sharp laughs from several of the security personnel. Female Navy SEALs were rare enough that most sailors could name them individually, and none of them had ever heard of Isabella Reeves. "Ma'am, I'm going to give you one chance to walk away from this," Wright said, her voice hardening. "False claims of military service are a serious offense. If you persist with this fantasy, you'll be detained and face federal charges." Izzy remained motionless, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the gate where the ceremony preparations were taking place. She could see the honor guard practicing their movements, the flags being prepared, the photographs of fallen warriors being arranged with military precision. Somewhere in that display was Logan's picture, and she'd be damned if she was going to let these people keep her from honoring him. "I'm not leaving," she said simply. Wright's expression shifted from annoyance to genuine anger. "Then you're under arrest." "Cruz, detain her." As the security personnel moved to restrain her, Izzy didn't resist. She allowed them to zip-tie her, hands behind her back, to search her small backpack, which contained only a water bottle, a protein bar, and a folded American flag, and to march her toward the security office. But as they passed the administrative building, Admiral Marcus Steel happened to look up from his morning briefing. That's when he saw it, the small golden trident on her wrist, partially hidden by the zip ties, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The SEAL Trident, also known as the Budweiser, was one of the most recognizable and respected insignia in the entire U.S. military. But what made Steele's blood run cold wasn't just seeing it, it was seeing it on a woman who was being treated like a common criminal. His 30 years of experience told him that something was very, very wrong with this picture. And Admiral Marcus Steel was about to find out just how wrong his people had gotten it. To understand the magnitude of the mistake unfolding at Naval Base San Diego, you had to understand exactly who Isabella Reeves appeared to be versus who she actually was. On the surface, she was precisely what Commander Wright and her security team had assessed: an unremarkable civilian woman with no apparent connection to the military world. At 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a lean but not muscular build, Izzy possessed the kind of face that disappeared in crowds. Her auburn hair showed premature streaks of silver that she'd never bothered to color, and her skin bore the weathered quality of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, though not in any way that suggested military training. Her clothing was deliberately nondescript. The faded Levi's had been purchased at a thrift store, The hiking boots were well-worn Merrills that could have belonged to any weekend warrior, and the gray t-shirt bore no logos or identifying marks of any kind. But those who looked closer really looked might have noticed the details that Cruz and Wright had missed in their rush to judgment. The way Izzy stood with her weight evenly distributed on both feet, ready to move in any direction without telegraphing her intentions. How her eyes continuously scanned her environment, cataloging exits, threats, and tactical advantages with the unconscious efficiency of someone trained to survive in hostile territory. The almost imperceptible way she positioned herself so that her back was never fully exposed to potential threats. Most telling of all was her breathing slow, controlled, and deliberate even under stress. While Boyd's heart rate had spiked during the confrontation, while Cruz had shown micro-expressions of frustration, and while Wright had displayed obvious anger, Izzy had remained physiologically calm. This wasn't the response of a civilian caught in an uncomfortable situation. This was the response of someone who had been in far worse circumstances and lived to tell about it. Her hands, now secured behind her back with zip ties, told their own story to anyone trained to read such signs. The calluses were wrong for a civilian, too specific, too purposeful. There were rope burns across her palms that had healed years ago but left permanent marks. Her fingernails were kept ruthlessly short, not for fashion but for function. Most significantly, if someone had bothered to examine her knuckles, they would have found the telltale scarring that came from repeated hand-to-hand combat training. But perhaps the most revealing detail was the one that Admiral Steel had spotted. From his office window, the sealed Trident tattoo on her left wrist. It wasn't the flashy, oversized design that wannabes typically chose. This was small, precise, and positioned exactly where a real SEAL would place it, visible to those who knew what to look for, but easily concealed when necessary. The artwork itself was exceptional, with the kind of detail and shading that spoke of significant expense and careful consideration. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or a fake tribute. This was the real thing. Around her neck, hidden beneath her t-shirt, hung a simple chain bearing 2 dog tags. Not her own, those had been officially confiscated and destroyed years ago, but Logan Martinez's, given to her by his mother after the funeral she hadn't been allowed to attend. The metal had worn smooth from years of unconscious handling, and the words were barely legible now, but she could recite every character from memory. Her driver's license told only the most basic truth. She did live at the address listed, a small cabin in the Cleveland National Forest about 90 minutes east of San Diego. The property was remote enough that her closest neighbor was 3 miles away, which suited her perfectly. She'd paid cash for the place 4 years ago, using money she'd saved during her years of active service, back when she'd had a different name and a different life. The cabin itself was spartanly furnished but meticulously maintained. A single bedroom, a small kitchen, a living area dominated by a stone fireplace, and most importantly, a workshop where she spent most of her time. To casual observers, it might have appeared that she was some sort of craftsperson or artist. The reality was far more complex. Isabella Reeves made her living as a security consultant, though her client list was carefully curated and her services were word of mouth only. Corporations hired her to test their physical security systems, to identify vulnerabilities that traditional consultants missed. She was particularly skilled at what the industry called red team, exercises simulating real-world attacks to expose weaknesses before actual hostile actors could exploit them. What her clients didn't know was that her expertise came from years of conducting similar operations in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Somalia. Places where the difference between success and failure was measured in lives rather than quarterly profit reports. Places where she'd learned that the best security systems were only as strong as the humans operating them. Her daily routine was as disciplined as it had been during her military service. She woke every morning at 0500 hours, ran 5 miles through the forest trails, completed an hour of calisthenics and weapons training, using legally owned firearms on her private range, and then began her workday. She maintained the schedule. 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. Without exception. The only variation in her routine occurred on specific date states that corresponded to missions she'd completed or teammates she'd lost. On those days, she would drive to different locations around Southern California, always alone, always carrying a small American flag and a bottle of beer. She would find a quiet spot, plant the flag, open the beer, and spend exactly 1 hour in silent remembrance before packing up and returning home. Today was one of those days. July 15th marked 18 months since Logan Martinez had died in a Syrian desert, and Izzy had planned to attend the memorial ceremony at Naval Base San Diego. She'd driven down from her cabin before dawn, prepared to honor her fallen teammate, the way military protocol demanded, only to discover that as far as the Navy was concerned, she no longer existed. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 6 years, she'd been one of the military's most valuable assets, conducting operations so classified that most of the people now detaining her didn't have clearance high enough to know they'd existed. She'd bled for her country, killed for it, and ultimately been betrayed by it when political necessity required a scapegoat for an operation that had gone sideways. Now, as she sat in the back of a security vehicle being transported to the base detention facility, she wondered if Logan would have found the situation amusing. He'd always had a dark sense of humor about military bureaucracy, joking that the only thing more dangerous than enemy fire was friendly administration. The vehicle pulled up to a nondescript concrete building that served as the base's temporary detention facility. As security personnel prepared to escort her inside, Izzy caught a glimpse of the memorial ceremony preparations in the distance. She could see the honor guard practicing their movements, the flags being arranged with military precision, and, most painfully, the photographs of fallen warriors being positioned for the ceremony. Somewhere in that display was Logan's picture, and she was about to miss the only opportunity she'd have to honor him properly. But Isabella Reeves had learned long ago that life rarely offered the closure you deserved. She'd simply have to find another way to say goodbye to her friend, assuming she ever got out of this situation. As they led her toward the detention facility, she remained silent and compliant, already beginning to formulate contingency plans. But she also found herself thinking about Admiral Steel, whose brief glimpse through his office window suggested he might have recognized something the others had missed. In her experience, flag officers didn't achieve their rank without developing certain instincts about people and situations. Perhaps there was still hope that someone with actual authority might ask the right questions before the situation spiraled completely out of control. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The detention cell at Naval Base San Diego was a sterile 8x10 concrete box with fluorescent lighting that hummed incessantly overhead. Izzy sat on the metal bench bolted to the wall, her hands finally freed from the zip ties, and allowed herself to truly reflect on how drastically her life had changed since leaving the teams. 4 years. 2 months and 16 days. That's how long it had been since she'd last worn a uniform, since she'd last been addressed by her real rank, since she'd last been part of something larger than herself. The transition from Lieutenant Commander Isabella Reaper Martinez Reeves to civilian security consultant Isabella Reeves had been more than just a career change. It had been a complete erasure of identity. The name change had been legally necessary. When the Navy had quietly pushed her out following the Somalia incident, they'd made it clear that her continued existence was problematic for certain people in very high places. The recommendation had been explicit: disappear, start over, and never speak about what had happened in that compound outside Mogadishu. In exchange, she'd keep her honorable discharge, her benefits, and most importantly, her freedom. Her cabin in the Cleveland National Forest had become both refuge and prison. The property sat on 47 acres of rugged terrain, purchased specifically for its isolation and defensive advantages. Every approach to the cabin was visible from the main building, and she'd spent months creating overlapping fields of fire that would allow her to defend the position against multiple attackers. Old habits died hard, especially when those habits had kept her alive in places where American soldiers weren't supposed to exist. The workshop that dominated the cabin's lower level served a dual purpose. To any casual observer, it appeared to be a woodworking shop where she crafted custom furniture and cabinetry. The reality was that it housed one of the most sophisticated weapons maintenance and modification facilities outside of military armories. She maintained an extensive collection of firearms, edged weapons, and explosive devices, all legal, all properly registered, but all capable of outfitting a small military unit. Her security consulting business, conducted under the name Raven Point Solutions, specialized in what the industry euphemistically called penetration testing. Corporations would hire her to attempt to breach their facilities, steal sensitive information, or compromise their personnel through social engineering. She was frighteningly good at it, with a success rate that bordered on the embarrassing. For her clients, what made her so effective wasn't just her technical skills. It was her understanding of human psychology under pressure. She knew how security guards behaved during shift changes, how executives reacted when presented with fabricated emergencies, and how entire organizations could be manipulated through carefully orchestrated scenarios. These weren't skills taught in business school. They were lessons learned in places where failure meant death. Her most recent assignment had taken her to a defense contractor in San Diego, where she'd been hired to test their classified materials handling procedures. Over the course of 3 weeks, she'd successfully infiltrated their facility 17 times, photographed classified documents, planted simulated explosive devices, and even accessed their computer networks. The final report she'd submitted was 37 pages of devastating security, failures that would require millions of dollars and months of work to address. But the money wasn't why she did the work. The money was just a means to an end, a way to maintain her independence and fund her real mission. Every dollar she earned went toward one of 2 purposes: maintaining her operational readiness or honoring her fallen teammates. The fallen teammates numbered 13, though officially only 7 of them had ever existed. The others had died during operations so classified that their deaths couldn't be acknowledged without compromising national security. Their families had been told they died in training accidents or vehicle crashes, bureaucratic lies that allowed the government to avoid uncomfortable questions about where their sons and daughters had really been when they died. Izzy had made it her personal mission to ensure that none of them were forgotten. She maintained detailed files on each man, tracking their families, their children's birthdays, their parents' health problems. Every year, anonymous donations appeared in accounts belonging to struggling widows or funds for military children's education. The money was always untraceable, but always exactly what was needed. Logan Martinez had been different. He'd been her spotter, her partner, and during their final mission together, the man who'd saved her life by taking a bullet that had been meant for her. His death in Syria had been particularly hard to bear because it hadn't been part of an official operation. Logan had been working as a private contractor, trying to earn enough money to pay for his daughter's medical treatments, when his convoy had been ambushed by ISIS fighters. The Navy's memorial ceremony today would honor him as a hero, which he had been. But they would tell a sanitized version of his story, one that omitted the classified operations where he'd truly proven his valor. They would speak about his service to country without mentioning the times that country had failed him. They would present folded flags to his family without acknowledging that his death could have been prevented if he hadn't been forced to take dangerous, private work to pay for his child's cancer treatments. Izzy's presence at the ceremony would have been more than just paying respects. It would have been bearing witness to the complete truth of who Logan Martinez had been. She was one of only 3 people still alive who knew the full extent of his service, and the other 2 were bound by classifications that would prevent them from speaking honestly about his contributions. The irony of her current situation wasn't lost on her. She was being detained for trying to honor a man who had died protecting the same institution that was now treating her like a criminal. The base security personnel who had arrested her were maintaining the same kind of blind adherence to protocol that had gotten Logan killed in the first place. As she sat in the detention cell, Izzy found herself thinking about the photograph that Logan's mother had given her after the funeral. It showed Logan in his dress blues, standing next to a young woman in a wedding dress, his first wife, who had died in a car accident years before his military service. Mrs. Martinez had pressed the photo into Izzy's hands, whispering that Logan had carried it through every deployment, every mission, every dangerous assignment. He said it reminded him what he was fighting for. She'd said through tears. Now that photograph sat on Izzy's mantle, next to similar mementos from her other fallen teammates. A small shrine to men who had died in service to a country that couldn't acknowledge their sacrifices. Every morning when she completed her workout routine, she would spend exactly 60 seconds looking at those photographs, remembering their faces, their voices, their dreams that would never be fulfilled. The detention cell's heavy door opened with a metallic clang, interrupting her memories. Commander Wright entered, flanked by 2 security personnel, her expression suggesting that the situation was about to escalate significantly. She carried a tablet and wore the kind of grim satisfaction that came from believing you'd caught someone in an elaborate lie. "Ms. Reeves," Wright began, her voice dripping with official authority, "we've completed our background check, and I have to say, your story becomes more interesting by the minute." Commander Jessica Wright positioned herself directly in front of Izzy, her tablet held like a weapon of accusation. At 38, Wright had built her entire career on attention to detail and unwavering adherence to protocol. She'd never encountered a situation she couldn't resolve through proper procedure and decisive action, and she wasn't about to let some delusional civilian make her look incompetent in front of her subordinates. "Let's start with the basics," Wright continued, swiping through screens on her tablet. Isabella Marie Reeves, age 34, born in Phoenix, Arizona. High school graduate, no college degree, no military service record of any kind. You've been living in that cabin for 4 years, paying cash for everything, no credit history to speak of. For someone claiming to be a Navy SEAL, you've done a remarkable job of avoiding any official documentation of your supposed service. Izzy remained seated on the metal bench, her hands folded calmly in her lap, saying nothing. This wasn't defiance, it was the practiced patience of someone who had survived interrogations by people far more skilled and considerably more motivated than Commander Wright. "What's particularly interesting," Wright pressed on, "is that we can't find any record of you existing prior to 4 years ago. No employment history, no tax records, no social media presence. It's almost as if Isabella Reeves was created out of whole cloth in 2021. Now, why would someone need a completely new identity unless they were running from something?" Senior Chief Cruz stepped forward, his weathered face showing the kind of righteous anger that came from 27 years of dealing with people who disrespected military service. "Ma'am, we've seen this before. Stolen valor cases where civilians create elaborate fantasies about military service. They study enough details online to sound convincing, but they always trip themselves up eventually." "Exactly," Wright agreed, turning back to Izzy. "So here's what I think happened. You researched Navy SEALs obsessively, learned the terminology, maybe even got yourself a realistic tattoo. You probably knew Logan Martinez from somewhere, maybe you dated him. Maybe you worked with him in some civilian capacity, and when he died, you decided to insert yourself into his story. Lieutenant. Commander Paul Mitchell, who had been summoned to provide additional perspective on SEAL operations, nodded approvingly. It's textbook stolen valor psychology. These people need to feel important, so they appropriate the sacrifices of real warriors. The fact that she specifically chose SEALs shows how grandiose her delusion is. Izzy's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her dark eyes, not anger, but a kind of weary recognition. She'd heard variations of this conversation before, in different contexts, from different people who thought they understood the world better than they actually did. The really pathetic part, Cruz continued, warming to his theme, is that she probably believes her own story by now. These stolen valor cases often start as deliberate fraud, but evolve into genuine delusion. She's probably convinced herself that she really was a SEAL. Wright consulted her tablet again, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a devastating revelation. But here's where it gets interesting. We did find one Isabella Martinez Reeves in military records, but she was dishonorably discharged from the Navy 4 years ago following a court-martial for disobeying direct orders and endangering military personnel. The silence in the detention cell became oppressive. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, suddenly less certain about the situation. Even Cruz frowned, recognizing that this information complicated their neat narrative about stolen valor. So either you're an incredible coincidence, Wright continued, or you're Isabella Martinez Reeves, a disgraced former sailor who's been living under a false identity to avoid the shame of your discharge. Either way, you have no business being anywhere near a memorial for real heroes. For the first time since being detained, Izzy spoke. Her voice was quiet but carried clearly in the small space. What exactly did the court-martial records say about the charges? Wright smiled triumphantly, believing she'd finally gotten a reaction. Disobeying direct orders during a classified operation, endangering the lives of military personnel, and failure to follow rules of engagement. You were stripped of rank, benefits, and discharged in disgrace. Not exactly the heroic service record you've been claiming. And the classified operation? Izzy asked, still speaking barely above a whisper. Obviously we don't have access to those details, Mitchell interjected. But disobeying orders in a combat zone is one of the most serious offenses in military law. Whatever you did, it was bad enough to end your career and probably endangered American lives. Cruz nodded emphatically. Real SEALs follow orders, even when they don't like them. That's what separates warriors from wannabes. You couldn't hack it when things got tough, so you got kicked out, and now you're trying to rewrite history. Wright leaned forward, her voice becoming more aggressive. So, which is it, Ms. Reeves? Are you a pathetic civilian playing dress-up as a warrior? Or are you a disgraced former sailor who can't accept responsibility for your failures? Because either way, you don't belong here. The interrogation continued for another 30 minutes, with Wright, Cruz, and Mitchell taking turns attacking Izzy's credibility, her motives, and her mental state. They painted her as either a delusional fraud or a bitter washout, someone whose presence at a memorial for real heroes was an insult to everything the military stood for. Throughout it all, Izzy remained silent, absorbing their accusations with the kind of stoic endurance that comes from surviving far worse treatment in far more dangerous circumstances. She thought about Logan, about the mission that had gotten her court-martialed, about the 13 children who were still alive because she'd refused to follow orders that would have killed them. The interrogators couldn't know that every accusation they leveled against her had been carefully crafted by military lawyers 4 years ago, designed to create a cover story that would protect classified operations while destroying her reputation. They couldn't know that her disgraceful discharge had been the price she'd paid for saving civilian lives in Somalia, or that the endangered military personnel she'd supposedly put at risk had been ordered to execute innocent children. But most importantly, They couldn't know that sitting in their detention cell was a woman who had been awarded the Navy Cross, 2 silver stars, and 3 bronze stars for valor awards that had been classified and then retroactively revoked when political necessity required a scapegoat for an operation that had never officially existed. As Wright prepared to escalate the interrogation even further, the detention cell's intercom crackled to life. The voice that emerged was crisp, authoritative, and carried the unmistakable tone of flag officer authority. "Commander Wright, this is Admiral Steel. Bring the detainee to my office immediately. And Commander, come alone." The 3 interrogators exchanged uncertain glances. Admiral Steele's intervention suggested that this situation was about to become significantly more complicated than any of them had anticipated. Wright's confident demeanor faltered slightly as she realized that her neat resolution to the problem might not be as straightforward as she'd believed. For the first time since her detention began, Izzy allowed herself a small smile. Admiral Steele's recognition of the SEAL Trident had apparently led to some very interesting phone calls. The truth was finally about to emerge, though she suspected it would be far more devastating to her interrogators than it would be to her. The walk from the detention facility to Admiral Steele's office should have taken 5 minutes. Commander Wright made sure it took 15, choosing the longest possible route that would parade Izzy past the maximum number of base personnel. It was a calculated act of humiliation, designed to showcase Wright's authority and demonstrate what happened to civilians who overstepped their boundaries. "Keep your eyes forward and your mouth shut," Wright commanded as they walked, her voice pitched loud enough for passing sailors to hear. "The Admiral wants to deal with you personally, probably to make an example out of your stolen valor case." Petty Officer Second Class Derek Stone, who was escorting them, couldn't resist adding his own commentary. At 26, Stone had been in the Navy for 8 years and prided himself on being able to spot phonies from a mile away. "I've seen a lot of wannabes try to claim SEAL status," he announced to anyone within earshot. "But claiming to be Logan Martinez's teammate, that's just sick." The man was a genuine hero. Their route took them past the memorial ceremony preparations, where dozens of sailors were putting finishing touches on the display that would honor fallen SEALs. Izzy could see Logan's photograph among the honored dead, his youthful face smiling. Beneath the gold SEAL Trident that had taken him 2 years of brutal training to earn. The irony of being marched past his memorial as a fraud wasn't lost on her. "Look at that," Wright said, following Izzy's gaze toward the memorial display. "Real heroes, unlike the pathetic wannabe we're dealing with. Those men died serving their country, not playing dress-up and telling lies." Master Chief Petty Officer Angela Torres, who was overseeing the memorial preparations, looked up as the group passed. "Is that the stolen valor case from this morning?" She called out, "Unbelievable. On today of all days, when we're honoring real warriors." Stone nodded enthusiastically. "Claims she was Martinez's teammate, can you imagine? Using a dead hero's name to prop up her fantasy." Torres shook her head in disgust. "These people have no shame. Martinez was one of the finest SEALs I ever had the privilege to work with. For some civilian to claim association with him is beyond disgusting." As they continued their deliberately public march across the base, more personnel began to take notice. Word traveled fast in the close-knit naval community, and by the time they reached the administrative building, a small crowd had gathered to witness the spectacle of the stolen valor arrest. "This is what happens when civilians think they can appropriate military valor," Wright announced to the assembled group. "This woman has been claiming to be a Navy SEAL, specifically claiming to have served with Logan Martinez. She's been living under a false identity for 4 years, and today she tried to gain unauthorized access to a memorial ceremony honoring real heroes." The reaction from the crowd was immediate and visceral. Sailors who had never heard of Isabella Reeves suddenly had strong opinions about her character and motives. The comments came fast and angry, absolutely disgusting. SEALs earn that Trident through blood and sacrifice. Using Martinez's name makes it even worse. That man died serving his country. She should be facing federal charges, not just base detention. This is why we need stronger penalties for stolen valor cases. Lieutenant Junior Grade Rebecca Walsh, who had served as a communications officer during several SEAL operations, stepped forward with particular vehemence. I knew Logan Martinez professionally. He was one of the most dedicated warriors I ever worked with. For this fraud to claim association with him is a disgrace to his memory and an insult to every real SEAL. Wright basked in the attention, using the opportunity to reinforce her own authority and competence. Rest assured, this individual will face the full consequences of her actions. The Navy takes stolen valor extremely seriously, especially when it involves our special operations community. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Johnson, a 20-year veteran who had worked with multiple SEAL teams, added his voice to the chorus of condemnation. Real SEALs don't need to prove themselves to civilians. They don't brag about their service or make claims about classified operations. This woman's entire story screams fake from beginning to end. The crowd murmured agreement, feeding off each other's righteous anger. What had started as a simple security incident was rapidly becoming a public lynching, with Izzy serving as the target for years of accumulated frustration about people who falsely claimed military service. The worst part, Torres continued, is that she's trying to attend a memorial for the very people she's dishonoring. It's like she wants to desecrate their memory in person. Stone, emboldened by the crowd's support, decided to press his advantage. Ma'am, did you really think you could fool actual military personnel? Did you think we wouldn't notice that you don't have the bearing, the knowledge, or the credibility of a real SEAL? Throughout this public humiliation, Izzy maintained the same stoic silence that had characterized her behavior since the detention began. She didn't defend herself, didn't protest her innocence, didn't show any visible reaction to the increasingly personal attacks on her character and service. This apparent indifference only inflamed the crowd further. In their minds, a genuinely innocent person would be protesting, explaining, defending themselves. Her silence was interpreted as the behavior of someone caught in a lie too elaborate to untangle. Look at her, Walsh observed. She can't even make eye contact. She knows she's been exposed. Wright nodded approvingly. Frauds always react this way when confronted with evidence. They retreat into silence because they know any attempt to defend their lies will only make things worse. As they approached the entrance to the administrative building, the crowd began to disperse, but not before delivering their final judgments. The consensus was clear. Isabella Reeves was a pathetic fraud who had dishonored the memory of genuine heroes, and her punishment couldn't be severe enough. Wright paused at the building's entrance, turning to address Izzy directly. I hope you're satisfied with the spectacle you've created. This is what happens when civilians think they can play soldier. Real warriors earn their recognition through sacrifice and service, not through elaborate lies and stolen identities. Stone opened the door, and Wright gestured for Izzy to enter first. After you, Ms. Reeves. Or should I say former Petty Officer Martinez Reeves. Either way, you're about to face the consequences of your choices. As they entered the building, Wright couldn't help but feel satisfied with how the situation had been handled. She'd exposed a fraud, protected the integrity of naval service, and demonstrated strong leadership in front of her subordinates. In her mind, this was exactly the kind of decisive action that would advance her career. What Wright couldn't know was that Admiral Steel had spent the last hour making increasingly urgent phone calls to Washington, and that each conversation had left him more horrified about the mistake his people were making. She also couldn't know that the woman she'd just publicly humiliated held more classified commendations for valor than most flag officers accumulated in entire careers. But most importantly, Wright couldn't know that in less than 10 minutes. Everything she thought she understood about Isabella Reeves would be revealed as catastrophically wrong, and that her own career would never recover from the mistake she'd just made in front of dozens of witnesses. Admiral Steele's office occupied the top floor of the administrative building, its windows offering a commanding view of the entire naval base. The space reflected 30 years of distinguished service walls lined with commendations, photographs, with presidents and foreign dignitaries, and the accumulated symbols of a career spent defending American interests around the globe. But as Commander Wright knocked on the heavy oak door, she had no idea that the next few minutes would fundamentally alter her understanding of military service and personal sacrifice. "Enter," came Steele's voice from within. Wright opened the door and stepped inside, gesturing for Izzy to follow. Stone remained in the hallway. This conversation, whatever it was about, clearly required privacy. The Admiral sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable, but Wright noticed immediately that he wasn't looking at her. His attention was focused entirely on Isabella Reeves. "Commander Wright," Steele said without taking his eyes off Izzy, "I want you to tell me exactly what happened this morning. Every detail, from the initial contact to the current moment." Wright straightened, confident in her handling of the situation. "Sir, at approximately 0800 hours, base security was alerted to an unauthorized civilian attempting to gain access to the memorial ceremony. The individual, who identifies herself as Isabella Reeves, claimed to have served with Logan Martinez and demanded entry to the restricted event." "Claimed to have served how?" Steele asked, his voice carefully neutral. "She alleged she was a Navy SEAL, sir. Obviously fraudulent, as we have no record of any female SEAL by that name. Further investigation revealed that she's been living under what appears to be a false identity for 4 years, with no verifiable military service record." Steele nodded slowly. "And how did you determine her claims were fraudulent?" Wright consulted her tablet, eager to demonstrate the thoroughness of her investigation. "Multiple factors, sir. No military identification, no record in our personnel databases, suspicious background with no verifiable history prior to 2021. Additionally, we did locate records for an Isabella Martinez Reeves who was court-martialed and dishonorably discharged 4 years ago for disobeying orders and endangering military personnel." "I see," Steele replied. "And based on this information, you concluded what exactly?" "That we were dealing with either a stolen valor case or a disgraced former sailor attempting to rehabilitate her reputation by infiltrating a memorial for genuine heroes," Wright said with conviction. "Either way, her presence at the ceremony would have been inappropriate and potentially disruptive." Throughout this exchange, Izzy remained standing at attention despite not being in uniform. Her posture was perfect, her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes fixed on a point slightly above Steele's head. It was the stance of someone who had spent years reporting to superior officers. Though Wright interpreted it as an attempt to mimic military bearing, Steele stood and walked to his window, gazing out at the memorial preparations below. "Commander, in your investigation, did you consider the possibility that there might be aspects of this situation that weren't immediately apparent from standard database searches?" "Sir, I'm not sure what you mean," Wright replied, though something in the Admiral's tone was beginning to make her uncomfortable. "I mean," Steele said, turning back to face them, "did it occur to you that someone with genuine military service might not appear in standard personnel databases for reasons related to operational security?" Wright frowned. "Sir, if someone claims SEAL status, there should be records. The Navy doesn't just lose track of special operations personnel, doesn't it?" Steele asked quietly. He walked to his safe, input a lengthy combination, and withdrew a thick folder marked with classification symbols that made Wright's eyes widen. "Commander, how familiar are you with compartmented special access programs?" "I have a secret clearance." Sir, but I'm not read into any SAPs, Wright admitted, suddenly feeling like she was navigating unfamiliar and dangerous waters. Steel placed the folder on his desk but didn't open it. Then you wouldn't know about operations that are classified beyond your current level. You wouldn't know about personnel whose service records are compartmentalized to protect ongoing operations or national security interests. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Wright felt the first stirrings of genuine alarm as she began to understand that her neat resolution of the morning's incident might not be as straightforward as she'd believed. Sir, are you saying that this individual actually has military service we can't access? Wright asked, her voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty. Before Steel could answer, his secure phone rang. The red phone that only carried calls from the Pentagon, SOCOM headquarters, or other flag officers with urgent matters requiring immediate attention. Steel glanced at the caller ID, and his expression became grimmer. Admiral Steel, he answered. Wright could hear only Steel's side of the conversation, but each response made her more uncomfortable. Yes, she's here now. No, sir, I haven't disclosed anything yet. Understood, sir. Yes, sir, I'll handle it personally. No, sir, there won't be any further security incidents. When Steel hung up, he looked at Wright with an expression she couldn't quite read. Commander, that was Admiral Harrison from Naval Special Warfare Command. He's very interested in learning how one of his former personnel ended up detained at my base for stolen valor. Wright felt her stomach drop. Sir, I don't understand. Our records clearly show. Your records show exactly what they're supposed to show, Steel interrupted. The question is whether you understand the difference between what's in unclassified databases and what actually happened. For the first time since entering the office, Izzy spoke. Her voice was quiet but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to briefing senior officers. Admiral, with your permission, I can provide my service number and authentication codes. Admiral Harrison should be able to verify my credentials within minutes. Steel nodded. Please proceed. Izzy recited a series of numbers and codes that meant nothing to Wright, but caused Steel to pick up his secure phone immediately. The call that followed was brief and decisive. When Steel hung up, his expression had shifted from professional concern to something approaching horror. Commander Wright, Steel said slowly, I need you to sit down. Wright remained standing, her military bearing keeping her upright even as her world began to tilt off its axis. Sir, I prefer to stand. That wasn't a suggestion, Steel replied. Sit down, now. As Wright reluctantly took a chair, Steel opened the classified folder and began reading from documents that would forever change her understanding of courage, sacrifice, and the true cost of serving one's country. Lieutenant Commander Isabella Martinez Reeves, Steel began. Call sign Reaper, Navy Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters, Silver Star with 1 oak leaf cluster, Bronze Star with V device and 2 oak leaf clusters, Purple Heart with 1 oak leaf cluster, 47 confirmed combat missions across 6 theaters of operation. Wright's face went white as Steel continued reading from a service record that documented 6 years of the kind of valor that most military personnel only read about in history books. With each commendation, each operation, each sacrifice detailed. In the classified files, Wright's confident narrative about stolen valor and disgraceful discharge crumbled into dust, but Steel wasn't finished. The worst revelation was yet to come. Admiral Steel set down the classified file and looked directly at Commander Wright, whose face had gone from confident authority to ashen disbelief in the span of 60 seconds. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of memorial preparations drifting through the windows. Commander, Steel continued, his voice taking on the weight of official gravity, the woman you've spent the morning humiliating and parading around this base as a fraud is Lieutenant Commander Isabella Martinez Reeves, one of the most decorated Special Operations officers in Navy history. Wright's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. She looked from Steel to Izzy, trying to reconcile the unremarkable civilian woman she'd arrested with the legendary warrior being described in the classified documents. Steel wasn't finished. He pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of Naval Special Warfare Command. What's more, the disgraceful discharge you discovered in your surface level investigation was a carefully constructed cover story designed to protect ongoing operations and preserve operational security for missions that officially never happened. That's impossible, Wright whispered. The court-martial records, the discharge papers, are exactly what they appear to be, Steel confirmed. Because sometimes, Commander, protecting national security requires sacrificing individual careers and reputations. Sometimes good people pay the price for decisions made by politicians who will never understand the true cost of their orders. Steel opened to another page in the file, his voice growing harder with each revelation. The Somalia operation that led to Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves's court-martial involved a direct order to eliminate a compound containing 13 insurgent leaders. Standard rules of engagement, legitimate military targets, completely. Authorized mission parameters. Wright felt sick as she began to understand where this was heading. What the mission planners failed to mention, Steel continued, was that the compound also housed 43 children, sons and daughters of the insurgent leaders, being used as human shields. When Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves arrived on target and identified the civilians, she requested permission to abort or modify the mission. Izzy remained at attention, her face expressionless, but Wright could see the tightness around her eyes that spoke of memories too painful to fully bury. Permission was denied, Steel said flatly. The operation was deemed too important to abort, and the acceptable civilian casualty rate was classified as tactically insignificant. Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves was ordered to complete the mission as planned. And she refused, Wright said quietly, finally understanding the true nature of the choice Izzy had been forced to make. She refused, Steel confirmed. She ordered her team to stand down, directly disobeying a lawful order from superior officers. 43 children lived because Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves chose to end her career rather than compromise her conscience. Wright felt like she was going to be sick. Everything she'd believed about the situation had been not just wrong, but catastrophically, career-endingly wrong. Steel pulled out a photograph from the file, a group shot of 13 Navy SEALs in full combat gear, taken in some desert location that could have been anywhere in the Middle East. He pointed to a figure in the center of the group, face partially obscured by tactical equipment, but unmistakably female. That's Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves with her team in Afghanistan. 2019. The mission she's returning from in that photograph resulted in the rescue of 17 American hostages and the elimination of a terrorist cell that had been planning attacks on U.S. soil. She was awarded the Navy Cross for that operation. Wright stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the warrior captured in that image with the woman she'd spent the morning treating like a criminal. The man standing to her left, Steel continued, pointing to another figure in the photograph, is Chief Petty Officer Logan Martinez. Not just her teammate, but her spotter, her partner, and the man who saved her life during their final mission together. The revelation hit Wright like a physical blow. Logan Martinez, the hero they were memorializing today, the man whose service she'd accused Izzy of fraudulently claiming, had been Izzy's partner and closest friend. Steele's voice softened slightly as he continued. Chief Martinez was killed in Syria 18 months ago while working as a private contractor. He'd been forced into private work because his daughter needed expensive medical treatments, and his military benefits weren't sufficient to cover the costs. Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves has been flying medical supplies to veterans hospitals every week for the past 4 years, using her own resources to continue serving the people who served alongside her. Wright's hands were shaking now. She thought about the crowd of sailors she'd encouraged to mock and condemn Izzy, about the public humiliation she'd orchestrated, about the righteous anger she'd felt when confronting what she'd believed was a fraud. "Admiral," Wright managed to say, her voice barely audible, "I had no way of knowing." "The records clearly showed." "The records showed exactly what they were designed to show," Steel interrupted. "The question, Commander, is why you didn't consider that there might be more to the story before you decided to turn this into a public spectacle." Steel stood and walked to his window again, looking down at the memorial preparations where dozens of sailors were putting finishing touches on a ceremony that would honor Logan Martinez and exclude the woman who had served beside him for 6 years. "Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves," Steel said, addressing Izzy directly for the first time since she'd entered his office, "please accept my personal apology for the treatment you've received on my base. It was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for the failure of my personnel to handle this situation appropriately." Izzy spoke for the first time since providing her authentication codes, her voice steady and professional. "Admiral, your personnel were following protocol based on the information available to them. I don't hold them responsible for decisions made above their pay grade." The grace of her response only made Wright feel worse. This woman, this decorated war hero, was showing more dignity and professionalism than Wright had displayed all morning. Steel returned to his desk and picked up his phone. "I'm calling the memorial ceremony coordinator immediately. You'll be seated with the families of the fallen where you belong. And Commander Wright will personally ensure that every sailor who witnessed this morning's events understands exactly who you are and what you've sacrificed for this country." Wright felt her career dissolving around her as she contemplated having to face the dozens of sailors she'd encouraged to mock and condemn a genuine American hero. The crowd that had cheered her decisive handling of a stolen valor case would soon learn that she'd publicly humiliated one of the most decorated special operations officers in Navy history, but as devastating as the personal consequences would be, Wright found herself thinking about something even worse: the look in Izzy's eyes when she'd been forced to watch the memorial preparations for her fallen teammate while being treated like a criminal trying to dishonor his memory. Some mistakes, Wright realized, were too large to ever fully comprehend, let alone forgive. The call Admiral Steel made to the memorial ceremony coordinator lasted exactly 97 seconds, but its impact would reverberate through Naval Base San Diego for years to come. Wright could hear only Steele's side of the conversation, but each clipped phrase made her situation more dire. "Cancel the current seating arrangements." "Yes, I said cancel them." "Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves will be seated with Gold Star families." "No, that's not a typo. She served with Chief Martinez for 6 years. "Yes, that Martinez." "No, I'll explain later." When Steel hung up, he turned to face Wright with an expression that had moved beyond disappointment into something approaching contempt. "Commander, you're going to walk Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves to the memorial ceremony personally. You're going to introduce her to the families of the fallen as Logan Martinez's former teammate and friend. And then you're going to stand before every sailor who witnessed this morning's debacle and explain exactly who they were encouraged to mock and humiliate." Wright's career flashed before her eyes. 38 years old, 14 years of service. And it was all about to end because she'd been too arrogant to consider that she might not have the complete picture. "Admiral, perhaps we could handle this more quietly." "Quietly?" Steele's voice rose for the first time since the conversation began. "Commander, you made this public. You paraded a decorated war hero around this base like a common criminal. You encouraged dozens of sailors to mock someone who's bled more for this country than most of us ever will. There's nothing quiet about fixing this mess." Steel opened another section of the classified file, his voice taking on the tone of an official briefing. "Since you seem to need the complete picture, let me share some additional details about Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves's service. Record. Wright wanted to flee, but military discipline kept her rooted in place as Steel continued his devastating recitation of facts. Operation Neptune's Fury, 2018. Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves led a 6-person team into Syria to extract a CIA asset whose cover had been blown. The mission required a 30-mile overland infiltration through hostile territory, followed by a direct assault on a fortified compound holding the asset. During the extraction, her team came under heavy fire from a force 3 times their size. Steel paused, letting the weight of the situation settle before continuing. Chief Martinez took a round through the chest that should have been fatal. Rather than abort the mission, Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves carried him 8 miles to the extraction point while directing her team's defensive actions. She kept him alive through field medicine and sheer force of will until they could reach medical evacuation. Wright closed her eyes, trying to reconcile this account of heroism with the woman she'd treated like a fraud. The CIA asset they extracted, Steel continued, provided intelligence that prevented a terrorist attack on a Navy base in Bahrain. 1,700 American personnel owe their lives to Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves's refusal to leave. A teammate behind, Steel turned to another page. Operation Desert Lightning, 2019. Deep reconnaissance mission in Afghanistan, tasked with identifying high-value targets for elimination. The team was compromised 3 days into a 14-day mission and found themselves surrounded by over 100 Taliban fighters. Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves ordered her team to establish a defensive perimeter, while she created a diversion that would allow them to reach the extraction point. She spent 18 hours alone, engaging multiple enemy positions while wounded from shrapnel, buying time for her teammates to escape. Wright opened her eyes to find Steel staring directly at her. All 5 members of her team made it to extraction. She was found unconscious from blood loss 12 hours later, still in position, still covering their retreat route. The intelligence they gathered led to the elimination of a terrorist network responsible for over 200 American casualties. The revelations continued, each one more devastating than the last. Steel detailed missions in Iraq, Somalia, Syria, and Afghanistan operations that would have been impossible without the kind of courage and sacrifice that define genuine heroism. But perhaps most relevant to today's situation, Steel said, his voice growing quieter, is Operation Crimson Dawn, Somalia, 2021, the mission that ended her career and saved 43 innocent lives. Steel pulled out a detailed mission report, classified at levels that Wright had never seen before. The operation was designed to eliminate a terrorist cell that had been planning attacks on American installations throughout East Africa. Valid targets, legitimate mission, complete legal authorization. What the mission planners didn't include in their briefings, Steel continued, was that intelligence indicated the presence of children in the target compound. When Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves arrived on site and confirmed the presence of 43 children ages 4 to 16, she requested permission to modify the mission parameters. Wright felt sick as she began to understand the impossible position Izzy had been placed in. Her request was denied, Steel said flatly. She was ordered to complete the mission as planned, with acceptable collateral damage defined as operationally insignificant. The children were deemed expendable for the greater strategic objective. Steel looked directly at Izzy, who remained at attention throughout the recitation of her service record. Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves had a choice: follow orders and kill 43 children, or disobey orders and end her career. She chose to save the children. The court-martial that followed, Steel continued, was a carefully orchestrated piece of political theater designed to provide cover for the officers who had issued the original orders. Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves was charged with disobeying direct orders, endangering military personnel, and failure to complete assigned mission objectives. Wright finally found her voice. But she was protecting innocent lives. That should have been considered. It was considered, Steel interrupted, and it was deemed politically inconvenient. The operation had been personally authorized by people whose careers would have been destroyed if the truth about those children became public. Someone had to take the blame for the mission's failure, and Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves was deemed expendable. Steel closed the file and looked directly at Wright. So they destroyed her career, stripped her of her identity, and created a cover story that made her look like a disgraced failure instead of a hero who chose conscience over career. For 4 years, she's lived with the official narrative that she's a washout who couldn't hack it when things got tough. And all that time, Wright whispered, finally understanding the full scope of the injustice, she's been continuing to serve veterans who have no idea who she really is. Every week for 4 years, Steel confirmed. Flying medical supplies to VA hospitals, using her own resources to help wounded warriors who served alongside her. Not seeking recognition, not asking for acknowledgement, just serving because it's who she is. Steel stood and walked to his window again, looking down at the memorial ceremony where the truth was about to emerge in the most public way possible. Commander Wright, in 10 minutes you're going to walk onto that parade ground and face the consequences of your assumptions. You're going to tell every sailor on this base that they spent the morning mocking and humiliating a genuine American hero. Wright stood as well, her legs unsteady as she contemplated the impossible task ahead of her. How do you apologize for something this catastrophic? How do you face people you encourage to mock someone who deserved their respect and admiration? But, as devastating as her personal situation was, Wright found herself thinking about Izzy standing silently at attention, maintaining her dignity despite everything that had been done to her. The grace and professionalism she'd shown throughout the ordeal only made Wright's behavior seem more inexcusable. The walk to the memorial ceremony would be the longest of Wright's career, but it would also be the most important, because sometimes the only way to honor a hero is to publicly acknowledge the mistake of not recognizing them in the first place. The walk from Admiral Steele's office to the memorial ceremony covered less than 300 yards, but for Commander Wright, it felt like a march to her own execution. Every step brought her closer to the moment when she would have to face the dozens of sailors she'd encouraged to mock and condemn a genuine American hero. Izzy walked beside her in silence, maintaining the same composed dignity she'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. Wright stole glances at her, trying to reconcile the unremarkable civilian appearance with the legendary warrior, whose exploits she'd just heard detailed in Admiral Steele's office. How had she missed the signs? How had her training and experience failed her so completely? As they approached the memorial site, Wright could see the crowd that had gathered for the ceremony. Gold Star families sat in the front rows, mothers, fathers, spouses, and children of Navy SEALs who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Behind them, hundreds of active-duty personnel stood in formation, their dress uniforms crisp in the California sun dot and scattered throughout the crowd were the same sailors who had participated in Izzy's public humiliation just hours earlier. Wright could see Master Chief Torres near the honor guard, Chief Johnson standing with his unit, Petty Officer Stone positioned with the security detail. All of them had voiced strong opinions about the stolen valor fraud they'd witnessed being paraded across the base. Admiral Steel had arranged for the base's public address system to be available, understanding that what was about to happen needed to be heard by every person present. Wright's heart pounded as she realized that her confession would be broadcast to the entire memorial gathering. They paused at the edge of the ceremony area, and Steel approached them with the memorial coordinator, Captain Sarah Mitchell. Wright could see the confusion and concern on Mitchell's face as she tried to understand why the morning's security incident was now involving flag officer intervention. "Captain Mitchell," Steel said quietly, "I need you to make an announcement." Before the ceremony begins, Commander Wright has a statement to make that will affect how we proceed with today's memorial. Mitchell nodded, though her expression showed she had no idea what kind of statement could be significant enough to interrupt the solemn memorial ceremony. She walked to the podium and keyed the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin today's memorial ceremony, Admiral Steel has requested that Commander Wright address the gathering regarding this morning's security incident. Commander Wright. Wright approached the podium on unsteady legs, looking out at hundreds of faces that ranged from curious to confused to hostile. Many of the sailors present had witnessed or heard about the stolen valor arrest, and they were clearly wondering why it was being addressed at a memorial for fallen heroes. Wright gripped the podium, her hands shaking slightly as she began the most difficult speech of her military career. Ladies and gentlemen, this morning I made a mistake. Not a simple error in judgment, but a catastrophic failure that dishonored the very principles we're here to commemorate. A murmur went through the crowd. This wasn't what anyone had expected to hear at a memorial ceremony. At approximately 0800 hours, I detained a woman attempting to attend this memorial ceremony. Based on incomplete information and my own assumptions, I concluded that she was either a civilian fraud claiming false military service or a disgraced former sailor seeking undeserved recognition. Wright paused, steeling herself for what came next. I was wrong, completely catastrophically wrong. She gestured toward Izzy, who stood at attention near the family seating area. The woman I arrested, publicly humiliated, and encouraged you to mock as Lieutenant Commander Isabella Martinez Reeves, one of the most decorated special operations officers in Navy history. The silence that followed was deafening. Wright could see shock, confusion, and dawning horror on the faces of sailors who had participated in Izzy's humiliation. Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves served 6 years with SEAL Team 5, completing 47 combat missions across 6 theaters of operation. She holds the Navy Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters, the Silver Star, multiple Bronze Stars for Valor, and the Purple Heart. Wright's voice grew stronger as she continued, finding strength in the truth she was finally able to tell. More importantly for today's ceremony, she served as Chief Logan Martinez's teammate, spotter, and friend for 6 years. She was the person who carried him 8 miles through hostile territory when he was wounded in Syria, saving his life and completing their mission. The transformation in the crowd was immediate and visible. Faces that had shown righteous anger that morning now showed shame and horror as they realized what they had done. Master Chief Torres stepped forward, her face pale with realization. "Ma'am, are you saying that this morning we were mocking Logan, Martinez's actual teammate?" "Yes, Master Chief," Wright replied. "The woman we accused of stolen valor and dishonoring Chief Martinez's memory was actually the person who knew him best, served beside him longest, and has been honoring his sacrifice in her own way for the past 18 months. Chief Johnson spoke up from the back of the formation, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "Commander, how is this possible? Why wasn't she in our system? Why did she appear to be a civilian?" Wright looked toward Admiral Steel, who nodded for her to continue with the full truth. "Chief Martinez Reeves was court-martialed 4 years ago for disobeying direct orders during a classified operation in Somalia. The official record shows she was dishonorably discharged for endangering military personnel." The crowd stirred uneasily, confusion evident on many faces. Wright took a deep breath before delivering the rest of the truth. What the official record doesn't show is that she disobeyed those orders to save the lives of 43 children who were being used as human shields. She ended her career rather than follow orders that would have required killing innocent civilians. The silence that followed was profound. Hundreds of military personnel stood frozen as they processed the revelation that they had spent the morning condemning someone who had sacrificed everything to protect innocent lives. Petty Officer Stone, who had been among the most vocal critics during the morning's incident, stepped forward. "Ma'am, permission to speak?" Wright nodded. "Ma'am, I was one of the loudest voices this morning. I said terrible things about Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves, about her service, about her right to honor Chief Martinez. How do we make this right?" Before Wright could answer, a voice from the Gold Star family section spoke up. It was Maria Martinez, Logan's mother, who had been sitting quietly throughout Wright's confession. "Young man," Mrs. Martinez said, standing slowly and walking toward the microphone, "you make it right by understanding that this woman loved my son like a sister. You make it right by knowing that she kept him alive long enough for me to say goodbye when he was wounded. And you make it right by treating her with the respect she's always deserved but never demanded." Mrs. Martinez reached Izzy and embraced her without hesitation. "Mia," she whispered loud enough for the microphone to pick up, "you should have been at the front of the ceremony from the beginning. You should have been the one giving the eulogy." The transformation was complete. The crowd that had mocked Izzy that morning now stood in respectful silence, many with tears in their eyes as they witnessed the reunion between a Gold Star mother and the woman who had served beside her son. Admiral Steel approached the podium, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, today's ceremony will proceed as planned, with one modification. Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves will present the flag to Mrs. Martinez on behalf of Chief Martinez's teammates who cannot be here today." As the ceremony began, Wright found herself thinking about the lessons learned in the harshest possible way. Sometimes heroes don't look like what we expect. Sometimes the most important service happens in silence. And sometimes the greatest courage is shown not in following orders, but in refusing to follow them when they conflict with fundamental human decency. The memorial proceeded with a solemnity and respect that had been missing from the morning's events, but the real memorial was happening in the hearts and minds of every person who had learned that heroism often wears the face of someone unremarkable, someone you might pass on the street without a second glance. The memorial ceremony concluded with a precision and dignity befitting the sacrifice it honored, but the weight of the morning's revelations hung over the gathering like a shroud. As the final notes of taps echoed across the parade ground and the honor guard completed their ceremonial duties, hundreds of sailors found themselves grappling with a truth that would fundamentally change how they viewed service, sacrifice, and the heroes who walk among us unrecognized. Lieutenant Commander Isabella Martinez Reeves had presented the flag to Logan's mother with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout her ordeal. The embrace between the two women had lasted only moments, but it conveyed years of shared grief, pride, and understanding that transcended the formal ceremony surrounding them. As the crowd began to disperse, many of the sailors who had participated in the morning's humiliation approached Izzy hesitantly, seeking to make amends for their actions. Master Chief Torres was among the first, her usual commanding presence subdued by the weight of what she'd learned. "Ma'am," Torres said quietly, "I need to apologize. What I said this morning about you dishonoring Chief Martinez's memory, it was inexcusable. I should have known better than to judge without understanding the full situation." Izzy's response was characteristic of the grace she'd shown throughout the day. "Master Chief, you were protecting the memory of a fallen warrior based on the information you had. Chief Martinez would have expected nothing less from his shipmates." Petty Officer Stone stepped forward next, his young face flushed with shame. "Ma'am, I was completely out of line. The things I said about stolen valor, about you using Chief Martinez's name, I can't believe I was so wrong about everything." "Stone," Izzy said, using his name for the first time, "you were doing your job. The Navy trained you to recognize and confront fraud, and based on what you could see, that's exactly what you thought you were dealing with. Don't let this experience make you doubt your instincts. Just remember that sometimes there's more to the story than what appears on the surface." Chief Johnson approached with several other senior enlisted personnel, all wearing expressions of profound regret. "Ma'am, we failed you today. We failed Chief Martinez's memory, and we failed the values we're supposed to represent. Is there anything we can do to make this right?" Izzy considered the question carefully before responding. "Chief, you can make it right by remembering that heroes don't always look like what you expect. Sometimes they're the unremarkable civilian, standing at your gate, asking for nothing more than the chance to honor a fallen friend. Sometimes the greatest service happens in silence, without recognition or acknowledgement." Admiral Steel, who had been observing these exchanges from a distance, approached as the informal receiving line concluded. "Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves, I'd like to offer you a ride to wherever you need to go. It's the least I can do after what you've endured today." Izzy shook her head politely. "Thank you, Admiral, but I have my truck in the parking area. I came prepared to drive myself home after the ceremony." "About that," Steel said, his expression becoming more serious, "I've been in contact with Naval Special Warfare Command regarding your situation. There are people in Washington who would very much like to discuss your future with the Navy. Your skills and experience are still valuable, and there might be opportunities for you to return to active service." For the first time all day, Izzy showed genuine emotion, a flicker of something that might have been longing before her professional composure reasserted itself. "Admiral, I appreciate the consideration, but I've made my peace with civilian life. I serve in my own way now, and that's enough for me." Steel nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with her response. "The offer remains open, Lieutenant Commander, always." As the formal interactions concluded, Izzy began walking toward the parking area where her vehicle waited. It was a weathered pickup truck, at least 15 years old, with a cargo bed that had clearly seen heavy use. The contrast with the gleaming staff cars and military vehicles surrounding it was stark, but somehow fitting for someone who had chosen substance over appearance in every aspect of her life. Commander Wright, who had remained at the periphery during the post-ceremony interactions, finally found the courage to approach. "Ma'am, I know there's nothing I can say that will undo what happened today, but I need you to know that I will spend the rest of my career ensuring that this kind of mistake never happens again." Izzy paused at her truck door, studying Wright's face for a long moment. "Commander, mistakes happen. What matters is what we learn from them and how we choose to grow. Use this experience to become a better leader, a better officer, and a better person. Ma'am, may I ask what you'll do now?" Wright said, "Where will you go from here?" Izzy opened her truck door and pulled out a small cooler from behind the seat. Inside, Wright could see several bottles of beer and a small American flag. "I'm going to drive to Point Loma and find a quiet spot overlooking the ocean. I'm going to plant this flag, open one of these beers, and spend an hour telling Logan about today's ceremony. Then I'll drive home and get back to work." "The medical supply runs," Wright said, understanding. "Among other things," Izzy confirmed. "There are veterans' hospitals throughout Southern California that depend on supplies I deliver. Wounded warriors who need equipment that government bureaucracy can't provide quickly enough. It's not glamorous work, but it's necessary." As Izzy climbed into her truck, Wright noticed something she'd missed during the morning's confrontation. The vehicle's license plate holder bore a simple inscription: "Gold Star Families, their sacrifice continues." "Ma'am," Wright called out as Izzy started the engine, "how do you do it? How do you continue serving people who destroyed your career? Who erased your identity? Who let you take the blame for their failures?" Izzy rolled down her window and looked directly at Wright. "Commander, service isn't about recognition or gratitude. It's about doing what's right because it's right, not because someone will thank you for it." Logan understood that. All my fallen teammates understood that. It's the only way their sacrifices make sense. She put the truck in gear and began to pull away, then stopped and called back to Wright. "And Commander, they didn't destroy my career. They ended my official service, but they could never touch what really mattered. I'm still a Navy SEAL. I'll always be a Navy SEAL. That's not something that can be taken away by paperwork or politics." As Wright watched the battered pickup truck disappear through the base gates, she found herself thinking about the profound difference between serving for recognition and serving from conviction. Izzy had lost everything: rank, career, official acknowledgement, even her identity, but she had never stopped being exactly who she was meant to be. The lesson was harsh, but necessary. Sometimes the most important service happens in the shadows, performed by people who ask for nothing in return except the opportunity to honor those who can no longer serve themselves. Sometimes heroes drive battered pickup trucks and live in isolated cabins, continuing their mission long after the world has forgotten their names. Admiral Steel approached Wright as she stood watching the empty gate. "Commander, I hope you understand that what happened today will have consequences for everyone involved. Some of those consequences will be painful, but all of them will be deserved." Wright nodded, accepting whatever punishment awaited her. "Admiral, if I may ask, what will happen to Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves? Will her record be corrected? Will she receive the recognition she deserves?" Steele was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Commander, some people serve for recognition. Others serve because they can't imagine doing anything else. Lieutenant Commander Martinez Reeves has never asked for her record to be corrected, never requested reinstatement, never sought acknowledgement for her continued service. She doesn't need our validation to know who she is." As the base returned to normal operations, the story of Isabella Martinez Reeves began to spread through unofficial channels, the kind of story that gets told in ready rooms and mess halls, passed from one generation of sailors to the next. It became a cautionary tale about assumptions and appearances, but more importantly, it became an inspiration about the true meaning of service and sacrifice. The woman they had dismissed as nobody special had reminded them all that heroes don't always wear uniforms, that service doesn't end with discharge papers, and that sometimes the greatest courage is shown not in following orders, but in refusing to follow them when they conflict with fundamental human decency. 6 months after the incident at Naval Base San Diego, the ripple effects of that July morning continued to reshape lives and careers throughout the naval community. The story of Lieutenant Commander Isabella Martinez Reeves had become legend not through official channels or military publications, but through the most powerful communication network in the armed forces. The informal stories passed between sailors in mess halls, ready rooms and barracks around the world. Commander Jessica Wright had submitted her resignation from active duty within 2 weeks of the incident. Her final fitness report contained a single paragraph that would follow her forever. Commander Wright demonstrated catastrophic failure in judgment during a high-visibility security incident, resulting in the public humiliation of a decorated war hero. While her actions were based on incomplete information, her rush to judgment and failure to consider alternative explanations showed a fundamental lack of the wisdom required for continued command responsibility. But Wright's story didn't end with resignation. She had taken a position with the Veterans Administration, working specifically with homeless veterans and those struggling with the transition to civilian life. Her experience with Izzy had taught her that service takes many forms, and that sometimes the most important work happens far from the spotlight of official recognition. "I learned that day that heroes don't always look like what we expect," Wright would tell new VA employees during orientation sessions. "Sometimes they're the unremarkable person sitting in your waiting room, asking for nothing more than basic respect and the opportunity to serve others. My job is to make sure I never make the same mistake twice." Master Chief Torres had remained on active duty, but had completely restructured the base's security protocols. New procedures required multiple levels of verification before anyone could be publicly detained for stolen valor, and all security personnel received training on the complexities of classified service records and compartmented operations. The Martinez-Reeves incident, as it came to be known in security training materials, became a case study in the dangers of assumptions and the importance of thorough investigation before taking irreversible actions. Petty Officer Stone had been among the most profoundly affected by the day's events. The young sailor had requested additional training in military history and veteran services, determined to better understand the complexities of military service and sacrifice. He eventually became a liaison between the base and local veteran support organizations, using his experience as a reminder that every interaction with a veteran deserved respect and consideration. "That day taught me that my uniform doesn't make me special," Stone would explain to younger sailors. "It just makes me responsible for representing something bigger than myself. Every veteran I meet might be someone who sacrificed more than I can imagine, and I need to treat them accordingly." Admiral Steel had used his influence to quietly ensure that similar incidents wouldn't occur at other installations. Through careful conversations with his peers, he had spread awareness of the compartmented nature of certain special operations records and the possibility that genuine heroes might not appear in standard databases. More importantly, Steel had initiated a classified review of other personnel who might have been forced out of service for political reasons, seeking to identify others who had been sacrificed for the convenience of officials who preferred scapegoats to accountability. Most significant changes, however, occurred in the broader military community's understanding of service and sacrifice. The story of Izzy Martinez-Reeves became a powerful reminder that heroism often wears ordinary clothes and asks for nothing in return except the opportunity to continue serving. Military chaplains began using her story in counseling sessions with service members struggling with moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when personnel are forced to participate in or witness actions that conflict with their fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. Lieutenant Commander Martinez-Reeves showed us that sometimes the most important choice is the one that costs you everything. One chaplain would tell struggling Marines, "She chose conscience over career, children's lives over her own future, and she's never stopped serving despite losing everything she'd worked for. That's what courage looks like when it really matters." The story also resonated powerfully within the special operations community, where the tension between following orders and protecting innocent lives was a constant reality. SEAL teams began incorporating her example into their ethics training, using the Somalia incident as a framework for discussing the moral complexities of modern warfare. "The easy thing would have been to follow orders," one instructor would tell SEAL candidates. "The hard thing was to accept the consequences of doing what she knew was right." That's the difference between a warrior and a soldier. Warriors understand that some lines cannot be crossed, regardless of who gives the order. But perhaps the most important legacy of that July morning was the change in how military personnel viewed their fellow veterans. The realization that heroes might be driving delivery trucks, working in anonymous civilian jobs, or living quietly in isolated cabins had a profound impact on how service members treated every veteran they encountered. VA hospitals throughout Southern California reported increased volunteer participation from active duty personnel who had been inspired by Izzy's example of continued service. Medical supply runs that had previously been handled by overworked civilian contractors were now supported by networks of active duty and retired personnel who understood that service doesn't end with discharge papers. The memorial gardens at Naval Base San Diego were expanded to include a small, unmarked stone bench positioned with a clear view of the ceremony area. No plaque identified its purpose, but everyone who knew the story understood its significance. It was a place for those who served in silence, who sacrificed without recognition, who continued their mission long after the world had forgotten their names. Isabella Martinez Reeves herself continued her weekly medical supply runs, driving her battered pickup truck along highways throughout Southern California. She had never sought recognition for her continued service, never requested that her record be corrected, never asked for acknowledgement of her sacrifice. But on quiet evenings, when she sat on her cabin's porch looking out over the desert landscape, she sometimes allowed herself to remember the moment when Logan's mother had embraced her at the memorial ceremony. In that embrace was the recognition that mattered most, not from the institution that had discarded her, but from the family of the man whose life she had honored through 6 years of partnership and 18 months of continued remembrance. Ultimate question that emerged from the Martinez Reeves incident was simple but profound. How many heroes walk among us unrecognized? How many people who've sacrificed everything for principle continue to serve without acknowledgement or gratitude? The answer, as every person who witnessed that July morning came to understand, was more than we could ever know and more than we deserve. True heroism isn't found in parades or medal ceremonies or official recognition. It's found in the quiet determination to keep serving long after the world has stopped watching, to keep fighting for what's right long after it stops being convenient, and to keep honoring the fallen long after everyone else has moved on to other concerns. Lieutenant Commander Isabella Martinez Reeves had taught them all that sometimes the most important battles are won not through force of arms, but through force of character. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to become less than who you're meant to be, regardless of what the world tries to take from you. The desert winds that swept across Southern California carried many stories, but none more important than the story of a woman who looked like nobody special until the moment she revealed herself to be exactly the kind of hero the world needed most, one who served without recognition, sacrificed without complaint, and never stopped being exactly who she was meant to be. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the heroes who might be walking among us unrecognized, then it served its purpose. Because somewhere, in every community, there are Isabella Martinez Reeves people who've given everything for principle and continue to serve in silence. The question isn't whether they exist. The question is whether we're wise enough to recognize them before it's too late. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.